Hello and welcome everybody to another in my series of book collection videos. This one's a little bit different because I felt like I needed to do an overview first of this particular series because it's a something that's very near and dear to my heart, and there's really not anything out there on YouTube about this particular series, which I find quite fascinating. There's little things here and there and some brief reviews, but outside of a video or two about the actual series and collecting, there's really nothing, which I found very surprising. So I felt like I should just do sort of a general talk and overview about a series that I've read and still read and continue collect and introduced me to not only the idea of book collecting, but getting into book series and, of course, mysteries and fiction in general, because it's something I grew up with, and is very near and dear to my heart. And that, of course, is the iconic and truly landmark series of the Hardy Boys. And this is actually the first book that I ever read of the series and what got me hooked on them. This is the reproduction of the original first volume from 1927. So, to give you an idea where it all started. So, this book series has lasted almost 100 years in various iterations and is still being published in again, there are more modern iterations, but the classic series started in 1927 with this edition of the Tower Treasure. Of course, this again is a reproduction. Um, but again, the importance to not only American culture, but literary culture and generations upon generations of young readers, both boys and girls, is just astonishing. Of course, the Hardy Boys are one of a number of children's book series designed by the Straightmeyer Syndicate, which basically came up with whole markets that they had cornered on developing and maintaining series for children. Of course, different ones kind of played out, but they all had central characters and would all be about different things, about everything from having sports series to flying air series to a more science fiction type series like the Tom Swift series. But the two mainstays were, of course, the Hardy Boys, and eventually Nancy Drew followed a few years later. And those two have really stuck with everybody who read them or came across them, and the names are still recognizable even to people who have never really read the books at all growing up or later on. Um, so yeah, the idea that people still know of these books and they're still bought and they're still published up to this up to this time period, and there's not a lot of information out there, and there's still no great major adaptation. There are a number of television attempts. There are the Disney series, well, I should say Disney serials almost, from the 50s that are pretty decent. Then, of course, the 70s television series that's very well known, but really kind of does its own thing. And there have been a number of other TV attempts since, but there's never been a great motion picture feature adaptation. Nancy Drew's had a lot more success in terms of features. There are the great 1930s films, and then, of course, the more modern attempts, and then the wonderful series of PC mystery games, which introduced the character to another generation. But the Hardys are just as important, and it's really strange to me that now talking about them, it's a very niche thing, but it's still a very recognizable series. So that's why I wanted to do this sort of overview and talk about how I got into the series. And the history is so varied that I couldn't possibly cram it all into one video. So this again is a more general overview and really more about how I got into the series, and then talking about some of the main edition types, because collecting Hardy Boys is a very involved process that you slowly get drawn into as you find out more and more information. The biggest thing that's helped me over the years is I started as a kid, and there was not any information out there, and due to use of pseudonyms, you were led to believe that this same author had been writing these books for 60, 70, 80 years, and all the various continuation series as well. So the notion of there being ghostwriters and then there being revised texts and original text, you kind of find out by accident. And then with the advent of the internet and amazing fan sites that are a wealth of information, that really just kind of kicked open the doors for me, and made everything make a lot more sense. So this has been an ongoing thing, an ongoing collection that I've been doing practically since I started reading, books bigger than tiny children's books. So I don't know particularly what age it was, but I, I was not, a very voracious reader starting out. It was something that kind of developed over time, but by age 5, 6, 7, I couldn't stop. So one of the foundational books for me again was this, which was my very first Hardy Boys book of any iteration, which is the revised text of The Mystery of Cabin Island. This is the plastic type of the picture cover. This is very, very common and very should be very well known to most people. They've been printed like this pretty much from the early to mid 90s all the way up until the mid 2000s when they finally stopped making new versions of these plastic covers. So this is the 95 printing. It's got a little bit of wear and tear, but this was my very first book. My parents, for some reason, got this particular copy. I don't know if they bought it. It was just suddenly on the shelf of books that we had when I was growing up. As a very small shelf of just random children's books that me and my younger sisters would just pull from. But I just happened to be bored one day and happened to notice this blue spine sticking out, and picked it up and started it, and that kind of did it. The peculiar blend of mystery and more two-fisted style adventure, because even though this was the revised text, it was obviously still written in the 50s and 60s and still had a lot of references that were, I don't even really want to say they were dated, but it was obviously from a different era. And I just latched onto it because, of course, it's through the characters of Frank and Joe, who are high school students, but they're obviously still boys and having much more adult style adventures. And it just, the whole idea of it just really, really captured my imagination. And so then, as it proudly proclaims on the back, there are more. So then, collect them all. And that mentality, it was like, you mean there's more? I have to get all of them. And so that kind of started this. I needed more. So yeah, this was my first one. This is still my favorite for those nostalgic reasons. But of course, this is the revised text. And I'll explain that a little bit in a minute. But I kind of want to give a brief overview of the various types, so it kind of makes more sense when I talk about original versus revised text and what exactly does that mean. So again, going back to this, originally the first volume, Tower Treasure, was published in 1927, created by the original series writer or ghost writer Leslie McFarlane, who wrote, I believe it's the first 16 volumes, and then wrote a few more after that. But they kind of started changing which authors they would use for different volumes. So McFarlane is generally viewed as the series creator, the guy who basically would have written, the book Bible for all writers to follow afterwards. Of course, he was presented with the general idea by the Stratemeyer Syndicate when he was originally hired. So the whole notion of there would be these two boys who are the sons of a world-famous private detective who lived somewhere off the North Atlantic coast in a town called Bayport, just off of Barmet Bay, and they lived with their parents, and they were amateur sleuths themselves, and wanted to eventually become as renowned and successful as their father was. And then they would also solve cases and crimes and things with their various school chums, who were all of a different particular character type. And so it's basically more like a set of bullet points, a basic outline of where they wanted the series to go, and basically almost like they were making an order. So it was up to McFarlane to flesh all of this stuff out, and he did astonishingly well. And I think it's the spirit and magic of these first books that he wrote that really infused, what should have been a very straightforward thing with some semblance of a soul. And that's what's led to the Hardys still being with us all these years later. Nancy Drew as well, of course, and you compare those to other series that kind of played out their hand relatively quickly, and you can definitely see the difference. So this is book one of what's known as the official canon series, of which there are 58 books, which ran up to the 1970s, the last one being book 58, The Sting of the Scorpion. However, what I was talking about earlier, the difference between original texts and revised texts basically means that starting in the 1950s, the heads of the syndicate, which were still publishing new volumes, realized that the older books were now, since they're from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, they seemed to them, to be dated and perhaps had some references that they didn't quite like. They were not always perfectly PC. They may show authority figures to be a lot more realistic and not always perfect or believable. And there are some elements of racial stereotyping and things like that that are, very intrinsic to the time period these are written in. Very much like what you get when you watch any classic era Hollywood picture where you have, again, racial stereotyping that is going to be of that time period. So you have to take all that stuff and understand the historical context of it. So instead of just, maybe putting disclaimers on books or, doing something like that, they took it upon themselves to do a new, essentially a whole catalog overhaul. And so all of the first 38 books, the 39th being the first modern book that was published and is where the revised text kind of stop. It's the first 38 volumes that were, and it's hard to describe this because they're all different. Different ones got different treatments, but they all carried the same title, still with the Dixon pseudonym. But all of these books were either completely rewritten, heavily altered, or slightly altered, and that meant slimming down the page count from 200 to 220 some odd pages down to always hitting about a 170 page count. Again, the whole notion of the books were streamlined. That's, I think, the best way to describe what happened. And I haven't got to read all of the original text, but when I was growing up, I got several books that were different than what I'd gotten in the library because I was already buying books at used bookstores, and I liked buying, antique copies or older copies or copies much older than myself. And I noticed they had different cover art sometimes. Some books have 2, 3, 4 different cover art variations. But then, they started out as hardbacks with dust jackets, and then eventually switched to different types of hardbacks, and then eventually switched to having the picture covers as dust jackets, then eventually as picture covers, period, and then eventually to the plastic style that was what was being printed when I was growing up. So, I started noticing differences between books that had the same name and the same plot sometimes, but, I was like, wait, this didn't happen before, or I read it at the library and it was like 40 pages longer. What's going on? So I kind of started picking this stuff up little bits at a time, but of course I didn't have, this is, long before the internet was a thing. So really it didn't get crystallized fully until I was able to read, the first, message boards or Hardy Boys fan sites or websites about children's literature or the Straight Meyer Syndicate or Nancy Drew. And then that helped formalize and crystallize everything in my head. So, to just kind of run through the editions and the most basic types that are out there. Again, this is not comprehensive at all because to do that would take many, many hours. And it's been done far better on some of the fan websites, which I will link to in the description. And if you've never read any of these fan sites and you're at all interested in the Hardy Boys, you've got to check them out because they're just a wealth of information out there that were it not for them, I'd still be stumbling around in the dark. So again, this is the replica of the original 1927 edition of the Tower Treasure, which is really probably the holy grail for Hardy Boys collectors. If you manage to find an original first printing with the dust jacket and everything in mint shape, it would be worth untold amounts of money. Simply because, like Golden Age era comic books, these were sold to children back in the 20s and 30s. So the first thing to go is the dust jacket, and condition is, very difficult to collect for. So that makes them insanely valuable the further back you go, and of course, the higher up you go on the condition scale. So if you want to pick up really nice editions and read the original text, the easiest way to do it is pick up these, which are from Applewood Books. This is from 1991 when they started these facsimile editions, which are beautifully well made. They reproduced the dust jacket, so it has the original white wraparound spine. And then the rear is a little modernized, so they could tuck in a barcode and reviews and actually tell you what this is, that it's a reproduction of the original text of the book. The other way to understand, to really see that it's one of the Applewood versions, they all have this printed on little sticker here, saying this is the original text, and they put the author's name, which is kind of unfortunate because it obscures the art, but it also keeps you able to realize this is still the reproduction. If you're looking at copies on eBay and they're trying to advertise it like it's an original version, but you can clearly see the printed on label. So that's really the only downside of these, is that it kind of obscures the cover art, but it also gives it its own distinct quality. And what's really amazing about these, they also took the trouble to actually reproduce the original dust jacket flap, which is exactly the same as original copies, listing the first few titles that were being published. And then the rear actually explains what makes this book special, talks a little more about the original text. But what was most amazing to me, because I've never been able to afford a clean copy original with this particular cover, which is only on the first printings of the first handful of books, they reproduced the original red hardback down to a T, except you do have the little Applewood logo here. So it's the same size and dimensions roughly as an original first printing, and it has the Hardy Boy Shield logo, which and it has the original Hardy Boys Shield logo that was on first printing. So this is a facsimile edition that is really stunning in its attention to detail. There's a few little things that mark it as being a reprint, but this is really the way to go if you want to collect the original text and have something that comes as close as you can to actually reproducing the original first printing without paying astronomical prices to get ones in great condition. There's a little bit of notes at the front and a little quotation from McFarlane's autobiography, kind of talking about the original texts and how they were revised and stuff. So again, this notion of letting people know who might have not known or probably didn't know back in 1991. But they also reproduced the original text and then the original front piece painting, which in all original copies is this sort of glossy style paper, and it's very different to the pencil sketch style drawing that became very iconic in the later printings. So yeah, this is an astonishingly good reproduction, and I'm kind of sad I didn't know or realize these were out there when I was a kid. I first saw them in bookstore sections, kind of tucked in next to the all the revised text, and oh my god, really. I first noticed these in bookstores when I was growing up. They would be tucked in next to the revised text, and that's what really first gave me the notion that there were, original versions with a different text out there. So they only went up to, I think, book 16, A Figure in Hiding, before they stopped. And now these are, very collectible. They're not super expensive, but they're not cheap, and you really have to kind of scour eBay for them. The earlier books are usually easier to find, like really books 1 through 6 or so. But yeah, the later ones can get very expensive because I don't think they printed them in high quality, high numbers. So like book 16 is obviously the most expensive out of the reprints. But one day I would like to have all of these. I now have a few that I've managed to get over the years. So anyway, I'm just going to go through some more various types. This is, again, much more of a general overview. So this is an original 1930s copy with the second style of dust jacket. The first style dust jackets follow what you see on the Applewood edition. I just don't have any original copies with the dust jackets. So this is the roughly the second style with the yellow spine. So this is a 1930s edition of Book 9, Great Airport Mystery. And this style of art continued for a long while, and so you can get series collections that all have the yellow spines. These editions exist for most of the first half to middle of the original text, and really date to about the 30s into the early 40s, and they have the distinctive orange end papers known as the Greta end papers after the artists. So this is the first main well-known style of end papers, and that's a way of because most of these don't have the dust jackets, and the copyright pages usually only indicate the original date. Looking at the end papers is usually a good way of helping to date a particular copy that you have. And here they've already switched over to having printed drawings, but again, they are full illustrated front piece drawings instead of, again, what we get later on, the more well-known pencil sketch version. But these are still really, really nice, and again, the original text, and also, they're not going to be quite as expensive as getting, first printing originals, but again, a lot of the books, transitioned over to this once they got into the higher numbers later on in years. But this is really the second main variety that you're going to come across. And then eventually they switched over into the picture covers, but with dust jackets. So they look like this. This is a picture cover copy of the Clue in the Embers, book number 35. So already we're hitting up higher in years. But this is one of my few copies that I have a original dust jacket that's still on here. Here on the back is an advertisement for the Tom Swift Jr. series. But this particular copy still has the orange Greta end papers, but they're a little bit darker. And I believe this particular copy dates to about, let's see, yeah, this particular one dates to 1955 and has the much more modern style of what we would see in all of the books of the 50s and 60s and the revised texts. So this is still an original text, but the revised version of this is one of those that made changes, but not to the very large degree of some of the revised text. But this is what most collectors will want for the main books. All of the dust jackets go up until volume number 40, Mystery of the Desert Giant, was the last one to have a hardcover with dust jacket. And then they transitioned over to making these picture covers the actual cover of the book, which I'll get to in a second. But what I wanted to also mention is you're going to find most, original hardcover copies without the dust jacket, or the dust jacket will be in tatters. So most of the original books are known as Tweed editions because the actual cover is this sort of tweed design. You have the revised Hardy Boys logo, and this is what's under, all the dust jackets of all of the later books. Anything that's not the first couple books in the original, red book cover hardcovers. So for the most part, this is what you're going to see for original text, and they come in a variety of different colors. This is a darker printing, and then there was a run of books made during the war that World War II that they had less materials to print on, so those have a distinct look. So there's a variety of different color casts to the brown tweed editions, but they all have the same general design, and they all have, for the most part, the orange end papers, and then they transitioned over eventually to having the later style end papers of the 40s and 50s. Now, when they switched over to the picture covers, again, they printed what was on the dust jacket onto the actual cover of the book itself. And I really have a fondness for these. I think these are the sweet spot of having, really great printed covers, but having the matching spines that all go on a shelf next to each other very well. And they really kept this design up until they switched over to making the plastic cover ones with the same recent art in the late 80s, early 90s. But what's great about these is for a number of books for a while in the early printings, they still printed the original text in them. You should never pass up what seems to be an older picture cover copy because it can always have the original text in it. Not all of these happened that way. They had already switched to this format after the revisions had already been going since the mid 1950s, and they didn't do the books in order when they rewrote them. They did them podged. So anyway, for example, in particular, this copy of Secret of the Caves has the original 1929 original text, has the picture cover with the final Rudy Nappy artwork that's on all the revised text copies. And then on the back, you can also identify sort of the age of a printing by how far the book list goes to. So this goes all the way up to book 43, Aztec Warrior, and that would date this sometime, I believe, sometime in the early 1960s. So I guess this is right before they published the revised text. Again, I'm not exactly sure that I can't remember the timeline off the top of my head because, again, they didn't do the editions in order when they rewrote them. But it does have the brown and white end papers, which usually indicates a 1950s or early 60s copy before they switched to having the white style end papers. But this is just a particular example. And when you get more accustomed to looking at these, you'll be able to tell the early and later printings on these picture covers by the actual printing of the number text and the black text. Usually on later copies, it gets a lot thicker, a lot more generic looking, and they don't look as clean in terms of layout as these earlier ones, even though it's still the same basic layout. But of course, a lot of these copies that came before this that still had the original text, we're still using earlier versions of the cover art. So here's an example. This is book 15, The Sinister Signpost. Still with the original text, but this uses an earlier cover art than what's on all the revised text. So, of course, you'll be able to spot ones like this pretty easily. If you pull it off the shelf in a bookstore or you're looking on eBay, it's still the picture cover type. It still lists this one also to Aztec Warrior, but it's still got an earlier cover. This is the same cover that's on the copies with dust jackets. And it still has the original text. This has the same brown and white end papers, so it seems to be from the same era. It's that copy of Secret of the Caves. But it's the original 1936 text, and it has the original front piece art. And this is another easy way to tell original text versus revised text. If you open it up and it has the more modern pencil sketch type drawing, and then the drawings mixed throughout the rest of the book, it's a revised text. You also check the copyright date, but if you have this original style art and an older copyright date and a slightly longer page run in terms of page count, then those signs combined with different cover art basically means it's an original text. So again, not all of the original text unfortunately made it to the picture covers, so you'll still be a few short. I know some fans have actually made their own by buying beat up picture covers, but with, a good cover, and just literally replaced with the original text pages out of, say, a copy with a bag cover, and just literally glued it together, made their own Frankenstein copy to have a whole run of picture covers with original text, which is a really cool idea, but I could never do that sort of book surgery. I'd feel too hesitant about it as a book collector. But anyway, that's an easy way to get original texts, and people just put them on the shelves in bookstores and they just lump them all together, particularly since the picture covers are so similar. But the more you look at these, you can then look for original text, which is something that I was very surprised by. I didn't realize original text made it to the picture cover era. So this is a very cheap and inexpensive way, if you're willing to dig through copies and look through copies, to get more of the original text. I hope to soon have all 38 original texts, because I want to do a full comparison and read all the ones I haven't read. I do have relatively most of them. I think at least half of the original text. So I'm trying to at least get good copies of all of them. And of course, it's going to be a lot more expensive to get original first editions with dust jackets. So getting them in these picture cover formats is a really cool way of doing so. And here's another example. This is book 33, The Yellow Feather Mystery. This again uses an earlier form of art. This is one of the books that has, I believe, at least 3 different cover art variations. 2 or 3 at least. So again, anytime you see an earlier cover art on a picture cover, or one you're not quite used to, that's a good sign that it's an original text. This again also lists up to Aztec Warrior. So I do believe this was about the last time they were printing original text this way. So pretty much once you get out of the brown and white end paper era onto the pencil sketch white end papers, that's basically, the point at which they had completely stopped printing original text. And again, you have the older style front piece art there, which is the other dead giveaway. So, and of course, they all will be a little bit thicker because these, of course, have page counts that regularly get over 200 pages, as opposed to the revised text hitting that nice streamlined 170 some odd pages. And then to give you an example of one of the later books and what all the revised text will look like. So they're also picture covers, also with really great printing on the art. I always loved the way the color came across on these, which it didn't always come across on the plastic covers, which also would crop the art. So this is an original printing of book 44, The Haunted Fort, which is one of the modern books, or the second part of the canon that's, from after the point in which they started revising the first 38. But this is an original printing and really nice shape, but it's still the same jacket design. Also lists up to Aztec Warrior as well. And this is where they switched to the white end papers, which is what you see on most of the picture cover copies, because this was used from the 60s and really, I think it's the late 50s into the... No, I take that back. The brown was the 50s and early 60s. This was early 60s to really throughout the 70s. And then finally in the 80s, they had what's called the cameo end covers, where it's just a weird drawing of Frank and Joe in like a doorway on the front and back of the book. But this is what you see on most vintage copies, and that's another giveaway that it will be a revised text for the first 38. But this is still probably the best version to go for, because you still get original art, and they're not the plastic covers. It's hard to get these in good shape because they are getting older, but they have the blue line top pages and everything. So it's also a goal of mine to get a full run of the picture covers in really great clean shape, like this copy and some of the others I've shown of the original text. I always picked up a mixture of new and used copies when I was growing up. Again, I always liked the idea of having books older than I was with, different printings, and I loved the blue spines, but then I also liked the plastic covers because I could buy those in the store and I already had those. So my original core collection of the books I grew up rereading over and over was a mix of these picture covers and then the plastic covers. So again, the plastic covers look like this, and they have the same motif, so they fit on the shelf and they all match. The idea being that you have a flashlight illuminating the back, and advertising that there are more books to collect. And then the end papers are blank, but you do get the full book listing, which is always really great. So you can actually make a checklist of the whole series, this going up to book 58. And then of course they all have the revised text, so you have... This is what the revised art will always look like in the front, kind of like this. And then there's your title page. And then the copyright date has a mixture of dates here. It's basically all of the original text dates, and then usually the reprints and updated copyrights. And then at the bottom on the these plastic covers, you'll actually see when it was printed. Earlier printings like this from 95, usually the binding is a little bit better. Most later copies, they're like really tight bindings. These also seem a little bit thicker on the earlier copies, and the glossiness isn't quite so much of a bright sheen. But this is something really minor, but it's just stuff I've noticed because I've picked up various printings, and if you just look at that printing date, you might notice that, like a copy from 2000, say, just seems like it's a little bit cheaper in quality. And then of course, because the binding's so tight, it doesn't open rather nicely like this. Of course, I'm trying to find one of the interior illustrations to kind of show you if you've never seen one before, but all the revised texts have random interior illustrations peppered through like this, whereas most of the original texts just have that really nice front art. So that was another thing that they did and kind of kept doing, but of course it was a much more streamlined affair in terms of the interior art. So again, just to do the whole overview of the scenario of original text versus revised texts and main editions. So your early first editions will be hardcover with dust jacket. This again is the Applewood reprint of Tower Treasure, the 1927 version with the cover art. Tower Treasure had 3 different cover arts, this being the first, and there was a second one also in hardcover. Then here is the 1959 rewritten text in picture cover. Again, this is a little worn, but this is the copy I grew up with. That was picture cover, because I was already collecting different editions by then. And then this is the plastic cover version that I grew up with. So I had both of these two on the shelves growing up, and I would just alternate between the two because I thought it was cool having the older one. But these, are the 3 main types: your original hardcover in various editions, and spine types, and paper types, and cover types, but featuring the original text for the first 38 volumes. And then your picture cover type, some of which do feature the original text, and some have different covers and went through several different covers. And then eventually there are reprints in the plastic cover type. Still picture cover, but it's this, actually relatively durable plastic that, some people really don't like these, but I grew up with these and I do have nostalgia for them. And they are pretty, easy to carry around and resilient. So they are, their own particular thing. Now, to briefly go through most of all of the later series and types and such, again, this whole thing is just a general overview that I kind of wanted to run through before I just go through my shelves of all kinds of Hardy Boys books, and I'll use terms that people, may or may not know, and I just didn't want people to get confused. And again, I thought it was kind of silly that there was nothing really about the Hardys or the books themselves, on YouTube or online anywhere outside of fan circles. So I just wanted to do a general overview. So the first major continuation that happened is commonly referred to as the digest. Groston Dunlap, which is the publisher of the original canon and maintained the rights up through all the reprints, was going to continue the series with book 59, which was The Night of the Werewolf. And it's actually listed at the end of first printings of book 58. Hardy Boys books are pretty famous for doing this. Pretty much all the Syndicate books are, where they will tease the next title somewhere on the last few pages of the book you're currently reading. And usually it's boldened as well. But apparently there was a legal case about the rights of the series. And what eventually happened was Groston Dunlap retained the rights to reprint those 58 books. So the revised 38 texts, the revised text of the first 38, and all the books through 58, which they already published. So, but the rights for new books went to Simon & Schuster, who put it under their Wanderer imprint. And so they picked up from book 59, which was, of course, Night of the Werewolf. And what's great about these is a lot of the writers who were already writing the books that were in the later books of the canon kind of continued on for the first few years of the digest. And the original designs look like this. This is a first copy of book 75. And a lot of these, like the original canon counterparts, do have a different number of cover arts. Most of these, they all had a similar design like this, and they have some pretty nice artwork, but they're all contained in this sort of design that gives you only a section of the artwork. And then the title like this. The spines match, so they all look nice on a bookshelf. And then the back here, they all feature internal illustrations. There's no front piece illustration, but for the most part, I haven't got to read all of these because they went up into the 200s when they finally stopped publishing them in the early to mid 2000s. But they have rather nice internal illustrations that are, full page, still black and white. But some of these are really great and do match up well to the canon books. Again, some of the same authors of the later books wrote a lot of these. But eventually when they got on down the road, in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I was really reading Hardy Boys hot and heavy, these were not as often well distributed. There was not a lot of information out there. It was just more Hardy Boys books, but they were all paperbacks, and then they kind of started trailing off more and more, and then eventually they killed the series off in terms of original Hardy Boys adventures that still continued off of, starting with number 59. So I never really got to read these, and the earlier books were not really kept in print after a certain point. The second variations, uh, they would reprint the books with the more modern art of the later ones. So here is the same book, but with the second art. This is usually known as the checkerboard because of the little checkerboard pattern that's in the Hardy Boys logo. So again, all these have matching covers and spines, and they'll always have a different sort of color background. But it is the same book, the same text and everything, and it was just done to modernize the older books and match, because they really didn't keep this design. I think it lasted until the first couple books after, like 80 to 85. I think that's when they transitioned over to this style. So this style didn't last a whole long time. And it's getting more and more difficult to find copies of early digests at all, let alone ones with the original cover printing. Um, I guess there must have been a addition to the legal case, because for a little while, Grosson and Dunlap started republishing the first of these in the plastic cover design, and they matched the plastic cover canon books, which I just stumbled across in a bookstore once, and I was shocked. I was like, wow, these are the ones I've never gotten to read. So I bought all the ones they had. They published those up to book 66 and then stopped. So now those are very rare and desirable, getting those first few digest books, but in the plastic cover format. So I'm very sad they didn't get to do all of them or more of them to make it easier to get all these texts. But it's kind of weird because those are digest books and they don't exactly fit with the original canon books, but they did republish a few of them that way. And then later on in the 90s, they switched to this more modernized design that honestly is not as effective, but this is the mid to late 90s design. They don't really match the older books, but they do match spines and everything, and they have a very red rear cover. Still the same series, still the same numbering, but by this point they were trying to appeal to a slightly different market with the cover at least. But the stories are still pretty good from what I've read of them. And then in the early 2000s, they switched to this very minimalistic style, trying to seem like actual files from a case notebook, or like you pull a folder out of a filing cabinet. And so, still continuing with the same numbering. This is book 164. But then they'll always have some sort of photo that's supposed to be tied to the book, but it's usually very generic. You don't have either of the Hardy Boys on the cover, which is weird to have a Hardy Boys book without Frank and Joe on the cover somewhere. But yeah, it's an interesting design, but it's very minimalistic. And by this point, they had long since eliminated the interior illustrations. But this is how you get the later books, and these as well are getting more and more difficult to come by these days. So again, this series ran up until 2005, and that's when they finally killed off the original series numbering. And there are a lot of fans of these, and they're pretty much the closest you get to having more books that are like the original canon books. A lot of fans pretty much stick to those. Some people go to the digest, but pretty much all the later series do make a lot of changes or modernize a lot of things, and that didn't really sit well with a lot of fans of the classic books. So yeah, this is really the only series that really continues the Hardy Boys in its original style. And I hope to finally complete my run of these. I would like to get every cover art variation. Say, for example, get all of the first arts and second arts and such. But I'm really just trying to at least complete all of the series, so I can then read them start to finish. I've kind of been holding off doing a read through of original text and revised text and everything until I can do a complete run through and then compare different texts and such. Because I've always wanted to see how the series has grown over time, but it's very difficult to do so when you're having to track down editions one at a time. Now, talking about things that rubbed original fans the wrong way and going way out there and dark and being different. In the late 80s, someone within the powers that be decided it was time to, give the Hardys a slight makeover and try to appeal to more mature readers. And they produced a series that most original fans don't really bother with. They didn't like very much because it was extraordinarily different and shook practically everything up. But I think more people are coming around to it, and I found these as a kid and became quickly obsessed with them. And it's now a very difficult series to collect because after Point they didn't print anymore, and there's quite a number of them, so it's getting very difficult to track down the last 7 or 8 books that I need. But this is the Hardy Boys Casefiles series, which is distinctive for being this smaller paperback with a matching blue spine for all 127 volumes. But these were designed for, more mature readers. So these are for, young teens and not, 7 and 8 year olds. So here you have the Hardys, dealing with everything from terrorism, international espionage, actual murder cases. They use guns sometimes. It is an extraordinarily dark take on the Hardy universe, and basically, I look at each book as sort of being like a very dark, gritty, low budget 80s action movie, but replace the male lead with two teenagers who just happen to be the Hardy Boys, but then their characters are taken in different directions. The tone for this book series was really set in book one on page one of Dead on Target, where Joe's girlfriend, ever since the Tower Treasure, because of course the characters magically never age. But to set the tone for the series, Joe's girlfriend, ever since 1927, is killed in a car bomb that was intended to kill the Hardys, was planted in their car, and then that gives Joe a guilt complex for the rest of the series and turns him inside out. And that whole complete shift in tone and darkness and everything, again, was very off-putting to a lot of longtime fans, but it being so different and really breaking up the monotony that series can go into, it's a really great alternative look at the characters in the series, and I love them. I've always loved them. It's not meant to replace the originals, but it's nice to have this really dark, gritty version out there. Again, there are 127 of them, plus 2 crossover books. They ran up to the late 90s when the series was finally canceled, unfortunately. They stuck with this cover art design up until the last 20 to 30 books or so, which really don't have very good covers at all. I should have pulled some of those examples out. I just forgot to. But for the most part, they're known for this really distinctive and very simple, but personally, I think very, very exceptional cover design. And of course, the darkness of the stories is reflected in their titles, which go from always being mystery of something in the original books to always having words like murder, death, torture, terror. So they are very, very dark. Not for everybody, but they're a heck of a lot of fun. And again, very, very dark and gritty. They're not all perfect. There's some clunkers. I've read most of the series. Again, I'm missing about 7 or 8 books, but it's getting very difficult to get these. I've had to piece these together like one at a time, scouring used bookstores. So I'm very close to completion. But when I finally manage to, I will start at book 1 and read all the way to 127 finally, which is something I've wanted to do ever since I started this series. But again, this is a particular favorite of mine, not talked about at all. And usually, if it is, it's original fans talking about how they didn't like how dark this went. But I really appreciated it, for having there being Hardy Boys books I could still read. When I was like 12 or 13, I'm like, wow, this is great. People actually die in these books, man. This is great. So yeah, the Hardy Boys Casefiles, a particular favorite of mine. Now that's pretty much where my collection kind of stopped. Originally, my idea was I just wanted to collect the original canon books, the original text for the first 38, and then the digests and case files. And over time, that expanded to my ultimate goal, which is probably going to be a lifelong thing because there's so many. I would love to collect every cover art variation and every major edition of all of those, which is pretty easy for the digests and case files because there's not a lot of variation. But then the original canon books, obviously I won't be able to afford minty first editions of the first 10 or so books because Tower Treasure copies, original 1927 copies can go for thousands of dollars. But that's something I enjoy chipping away at, and it's a heck of a lot of fun, and you learn a lot about book collecting. but the more modern attempts at keeping the series going, I didn't really, I wasn't really a fan of or into or anything. But over time, when I see them in used bookstores, especially since they've switched to making other series, I started picking some of them up because, I didn't want to kick myself later when they were out of print and rare, and I'd have to pay a lot on eBay for particular copies. So I did start picking up books in the Undercover Brothers series. This is the early to really like the mid 2000s series. They started in covers like this, and I'm really not a fan of these because they switch to a first person perspective, and they also switch between the brothers for each chapter, which is a really awkward um, switch after reading everything is an omniscient viewpoint for decades and decades. Um, so yeah, I did start picking these up. They eventually switched to an art design like this. Um, so I have a good number of these, and this is just because eventually they'll switch to doing another series, and then these copies have already started drying up. So if I see inexpensive copies on used bookstore shelves, then I definitely go ahead and grab them because when you get these for a buck or two, sometimes it's much better to just go ahead and get them because 5 years down the road when they're all out of print, it's like, why didn't I get these earlier? But yeah, this is the more modern style of attempt at keeping the series going that I'm not really a fan of. They did recently do a new reprinting of some of the first books of the Canon series with a more modernized art style. I think they did the first 8 or so, but it's still the revised text. So I'm not really a fan of those because the art is kind of leaves a lot to be desired, but it was cool that they were doing a new reprinting, but it also meant the plastic covers and the revised text covers and all that stuff was finally dead and buried, which is kind of sad in a way because I'd hope they would just keep reprinting those editions over and over and over so new generations could discover them. Now, last, I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the crossover between the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, being obviously the other big franchise series for the Straight Meyer Syndicate, and they're kind of joined at the hip in a lot of ways. It's the exact same uh, in terms of the book series that you have. Nancy Drew had the original canon books. The original books were, up to a certain point, were rewritten and revised texts, and they followed the same in terms of having hardcovers with dust jackets, then picture covers, then the plastic covers, and then the digests, and they also had a paperback series for more mature readers called the Nancy Drew Files and such. So they have done a number of crossovers over the years. The first major one being in the digest era, known as the Super Sleuths. I believe there are, I think there's 2 in this series. They didn't really do a whole lot with it at this point, but this was the first major pairing up. And again, this was done in the digest era, which is why it has the digest cover and it matches, and it just goes on the shelf right along with the other ones. So this is the first example. Then they did a little bit later in the 80s, they did this is basically a choose your own adventure. It's called Be a Detective Mystery Stories, but they did a number, I think maybe 4 or 5 of these with both Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys. But again, it's a choose your own adventure book. And these are kind of fun, especially for fans of either series, and they're not super common. I believe I have the first 4 of these. So again, anytime I can chip away at any particular run of the books, I definitely just grab it and go for it. And thankfully, I mean, they're never very expensive outside of being outside of the original very collectible editions. But yeah, this was the second attempt, but it's basically just a choose your own adventure. The primary attempt happened a little bit later in the 80s and was a very long running series, lasted through the mid to late 90s. But that is the Nancy Drew Hardy Boys Super Mystery series. There's about, if I'm remembering correctly off the top of my head, it's about 20, 27 or it's roughly around 30 books in this series. So it had a good run. Most of them have covers like this. Eventually, later on, they switched to a more, photo collage style cover, like the later Hardy Boys Digest or Casefiles books did. But these are largely pretty good. I've read most of them. I have most of them outside of. I think I'm missing maybe about 4 or 5 to complete the run. But yeah, this is the primary combination of the two series characters and some of their side characters as well, and they interact with each other in a pretty interesting way. But honestly, when you read these books, it's sort of like its own thing. It's not exactly connected to either the then concurrently running Hardy's or Nancy series. So I guess you could look at this more of like a comic team up that was its own thing in comics and kind of separate from the main line of either character that it brought together. So it's an interesting attempt, and again, these are relatively solid. And if you're already a fan of either series, then you can start picking these up. And these again have gotten more difficult to find over the years because they've never been reprinted. And then finally, and this is the last one I know of. This is from about 2007, I believe, or so. But when they were doing the Modern Nancy books, they also concurrently tied them to the Undercover Brothers series and made a new series of super mysteries that look like this. I have 3 of them. I think there may be 4 or 5, so that's how many they got to. But they actually did tie these to the book series that were already going. So you actually see the Undercover Brothers are listed on this cover. So it does have the modern style of formatting and first person viewpoints like those series do. But I just recently got these because I just not gotten the chance to pick these up beforehand. And now that I'm finally getting some of those later books, I was like, well, I might as well grab the crossovers while they're still available at decent prices. So this is the last real attempt at doing a crossover that they've done. The only other thing I should mention, in the Nancy Drew PC games that are very beloved by a lot of fans, there are mentions and references, and the Hardy Boys do appear. And then they finally gave them their own game by the same developers. So that's really the one main Hardy Boys game, but it's not really as good as the. It's not as inventive as the Nancy Drew games that followed that preceded it. But I'm not. I've never been much of a point and click mystery PC gamer. I enjoy them every once in a while. I've played some of those, but it's not really my thing. I get too easily frustrated with some of them. But yeah, that's their one major foray into video gaming for the most part. So that's basically the sort of overview and rundown that I wanted to do as part of this video before I tried to even tackle my Hardy Boys collection, or as I like to refer to it, my wall of blue that I've accumulated over the years. I figured it'd be helpful to kind of do, again, a very general, very brief rundown overview. And this is by no means a complete, run through of every edition type because there's so many and so many variations. And again, it's only been documented really by the dedicated fan groups and fans who started websites and connected with other fans to get this information out there. So there are still variations that pop up here and there, and it's still something that I find continual new information out about. But anyway, I thought it would be helpful to get something out there first before I just jump into my overall collection, because that's probably going to be at least several, if not many, video uploads, because trying to break it up, I now have, I don't even know the numbers of how many Hardy's books that I have, but it's definitely well over 100, if not 200. So it's definitely going to take some time to go through in my usual video forum series. But I just wanted to kind of talk about my personal history with the books and the characters of Frank and Joe over the years, and then some of the other book series and the different edition types. So then that way, when I do start talking about the editions I own, that people wouldn't get confused about me talking about original text and revised text and second cover, third cover, in paper type, hardcover, picture cover, dust jacket, all the various different editions out there, and all the different terminology that fans like myself know and use, but maybe not everybody else would understand. So again, it all goes back to this particular copy of the revised text of Cabin Island. And one that I read when I was about 5 years old or so, and that's what started all of this. So it's been a lifelong pursuit, and will continue to be a lifelong pursuit, collecting and always coming back to and finding enjoyment in these books, and now finally reading all of the, or at least trying to read all of the original text finally. of the first 38 books. And it's definitely an eye-opener for somebody like me who's used to the revised text, particularly in the first McFarlane books, because it's such a different experience, even though the stories themselves are roughly the same in terms of plot points. But it's really great to go back to the very beginning and see how the series started. But yeah, it's really an interesting experience to compare types of the same book, even though they may share the same title. They are completely different at times. But anyway, that's again, it's just my personal history with the series, and then just a general overview of the main types of not only the original canon books, but then the main continuation series of the digests and the case files, and some of the crossovers and later book series. So again, hopefully this has been informative. Hopefully you guys out there know of the Hardy Boys at least, and or for those who have fond memories, this may encourage you to go back with copies you may still have, or maybe track down some used copies, and hopefully you get the bug, although maybe not as badly as I have, because it's something that, again, I have accumulated so many. It's just a giant bookshelf that's nothing but blue, and I'm staring at it now, and I'm trying to find new ways to cram in new books, and I need to get a whole other bookcase, because it's just it always overgrows, and it's definitely the largest book collection that I have, because it's really what got me started collecting books, because I simply wanted my own copies, and I didn't want to have to resort to constantly getting them from the library and get dog-eared copies and stuff. And I wanted all the different artworks that I found, all the different covers, and then I started getting the older editions and used bookshops. And the first goal was to just get all 58, and then there were more out there, and then I found out there were different text versions of some of them, and then the different covers, and then the older ones I started getting the original Tweed hardcovers. I had a couple of those, and then once I finished the first 58 in the canon, then I got some of the continuation books and some of the digests, and then I got started on the Casefiles, and yeah, it keeps ballooning, but it's a very interesting experience, and it's a part of my childhood, so there's definitely a lot of nostalgia there, which it seems to be for most fans. Most dedicated fans got hooked on them when they were kids, so there's a lot of fond memories, and people have a lot of fun going back and trying to track down whatever books they're after for whatever collection they want, whether it's just the original 38 text or the original canon, or they get into the digest and case files and things like that. So it's a real a treasure search, a real for most of the later books, it's not anything that's very expensive, but it's the thrill of trying to track down and complete a whole series run. I'm sure it's much like what you get in collecting comics or any other book series, especially something as long running as the Hardy Boys. And again, this was also spurred on by the fact there's not a lot of information out there. There's not a lot of stuff in popular culture. There's never been a successful adaptation, and but it's something that's been with us for almost a century, and I felt it was high time to actually get something on my YouTube channel about one of my life's obsessions. So with that, hopefully you gain some new appreciation for children's literature, perhaps, or maybe might take a dive in Barmet Bay and take a visit to Bayport to solve a case with Frank and Joe if you haven't before or haven't done it in a long time. Maybe relive some childhood memories and such. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned. I will hopefully get the first of my Hardy collection. I'm probably going to have to break it up into specific segments, but I guess I'll start with the canon books and just do a whole video on those, and just kind of break it up in segments, because it's going to be, trust me, it's going to be very long. So every time I do a collection video, it takes me a lot longer to do it, and it always comes out to being, I think it's going to be 20 minutes. It's more like an hour. So magnify that times a lot of editions and a lot of books and a lot of history to go through. So it's definitely going to be a process. So and once I do that, I'd also like to start doing text comparisons. So that's something I'm planning on doing, is doing some videos comparing the original text versions that I own to the revised text, because I've always wanted to do that. So I'm trying to complete my original text run, have at least one version of each copy of that has the original text in it of the first 38. I think about 25 or 26 original texts, so I'm missing some, but if I can get the others, I'm going to try and do a comparison video for most, if not all of them, is what I'd like to do. So I'd like to do that as well. So definitely there's going to be a lot more Hardy Boys content in the future, and hopefully that might generate some more Hardy content on YouTube. So until then, thank you so much for watching, as always, guys.